Hello and welcome to another episode of Challenging Conspiracies with Crafty Keela. Today's video will concentrate on the fine line presented between what is science and what is considered pseudoscience. Can there be an answer to this, or is it simply philosophical? And why does it matter? This series is a sociological look at how and why conspiracy theorists put forward their arguments. This is an important component in understanding why their ideas sometimes stick. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell to receive updates on my latest videos. The question of what we consider to be scientific has raged on for centuries, with even Aristotle demanding a theory, without bias, to be beyond just a hypothesis, but actually being practically demonstrable and repeatable. But where is the line when it comes to pseudoscience, or is there one? To introduce this topic, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Tony Purcell. Most of you know him as PhD Tony. Tony's channel will be linked in the description below.
Veteran observers of discussions between scientists and proponents of the anti-science movement will doubtless recognise that there are many occasions on which these discussions founder over what is science. The scientist will introduce some result into evidence, and the anti-science proponent will simply hand-wave it away as not being valid science. They will suggest that science is A, B or C, and this isn't A, B or C, therefore it isn't science. The sad reality is that the boundary between science and pseudoscience is actually not well defined. There is no universally accepted heuristic for determining what is science and what is pseudoscience. The issue of distinguishing between science and pseudoscience is a philosophical problem called the demarcation problem. This was famously addressed by Karl Popper, who decided that the only important criterion was falsifiability. But given that astrology is falsifiable, but astrology is definitely not a science, many people were unhappy with this definition. Thomas Kuhn suggested that the main issue was problem-solving ability, the ability to solve problems that had been previously encountered, as well as novel problems that emerged after the science had been developed. Feyerabend suggested that there essentially was no distinction between science or pseudoscience. There was only the social interpretation of science and pseudoscience. Thagard suggested that pseudoscience is regressive rather than progressive. Progressive disciplines expand our understanding of the universe and our ability to model them accurately, but regressive ideologies discard our understanding of the universe. They throw away things that are already well accepted and well understood, and that was one of his key criteria. But even after all of the discussion between these various luminaries, there is no firm answer yet as to what it is that distinguishes science from pseudoscience. Like many things, when you get down into the weeds, it becomes very difficult to actually objectively define where the boundary should be. As a professional scientist, I will say that this is all very philosophically interesting, but that science has done a pretty phenomenal job over the past 4 centuries advancing us from the age of sail to the age of space exploration. I don't see that there's any inadequacy in the way science has operated over these 4 centuries. So I think that this mechanism is perfectly satisfactory. The problem from the anti-science point of view is that it doesn't work for them. Because as soon as they accept that science has made significant strides over the past 4 centuries, and that peer review and publishing in the literature is the way science is approached, they instantly get thrown out of the conversation because they have nothing to contribute. They're never going to make it past peer review, and that's just that. So they are desperate to prevent the conversation from turning into one of actual expertise, and instead they want to mine the conversation into a little-known philosophical problem. They can assert that they have demonstrated the answer to this, that they know exactly where the boundary between science and pseudoscience lies. they're just lying when they maintain that, because there is no universally accepted answer to that question.
Thank you, Tony, for that eloquent introduction. So let's get into the demarcation problem and try to clarify what and how the blurred lines between science and anti-science is manipulated by conspiracy theorists for their gain. The scientific method. The scientific method is a guideline to be used to prove a hypothesis or an idea. The steps are as follows. Pose the question. Research the work that has already been done in this area. Form your own idea or hypothesis. Test it, document the test, and draw a conclusion that is repeatable and demonstrable. The final step, that is often left out by anti-science or pseudoscience, is peer review. This is an important final step. If 100 people or 1,000 or 10,000 people then test your idea and the majority of these testers come to a different conclusion to you, then it's not considered a scientific success. It's time to go back to the drawing board. Tony used astrology and astronomy as an example of two conflicting similar fields, with the former being considered by most as pseudoscience, as it can't be demonstrated consistently that the planets or the stars have any impact on human personality. I'd like to propose another example. Most people are not able to tell the difference between a nutritionist and a dietitian. Dietitians are registered, fully qualified professionals who are held to the highest standard of care to clients' medical needs. Nutritionists are often qualified to only give advice about healthy diets. They are not permitted to make dietary decisions based on medical needs. Although registered nutritionists are held to a certain standard, we then have nutritional therapists who bring a bad name to genuine nutritionists by promoting often untested and unproven cures such as homeopathy. And the less I say about that practice, the better. Though many nutritionists work alongside dietitians, the vast majority are unregistered and are way overpriced for the lack of qualifications that they have, and they often create hostility towards traditional forms of medicine. So back to the demarcation problem and how it relates to our friends in the conspiracy world. This time I will turn to a guy who believes that anyone putting on a white coat makes them a doctor, Mr. Anthony Riley. Please wear facepalm protection for this clip, in which he challenges fellow flurf Bob Nodell of Globebusters.
We found that we were picking up a drift, a 15-degree-per-hour drift.
Thanks, Bob. In determining what terminology to use in explaining gravity without calling it gravity.
The problem is, because I did it, it means that something else that you want to infer cannot be done within scientific method. It can only be done outside of scientific method, and by virtue of that fact, puts it into the pseudoscience bracket. Because you have to be within scientific method, otherwise you are pushing pseudoscience.
So here, Sleeping Warrior gives the game away yet again. He states that because he defines his experiment as using the scientific method, any challenge to his experiment that draws different conclusions to him is done outside of the scientific method and therefore is pseudoscience. The biggest issue in distinguishing what is science is who gets to define it. While hard, definitive, repeatable evidence is a good start, it cannot account for the small pockets of grey where conspiracy theorists exploit. One of the most obvious distortions of this is the theory of gravity. Isaac Newton, one of the greatest minds of the last 1,000 years, described gravity as a force in which large masses attract smaller masses towards it. Working off Kepler's work in understanding planetary orbits, Newton was able to explain the intricacies of the gravitational pull better than anyone had done before him. Over 200 years later, Albert Einstein took Newton's work and went that one step further, filling in the gaps with updated language. It is here in this updated language that pseudoscience has stepped in to exploit a fabricated conflict between the two theories. The modern criteria for the demarcation problem has its roots with Sir Karl Popper, a prominent philosopher and academic of the 20th century. Popper asserted that the central thesis was but a linguistical framework for an observation rather than the experiment or conclusion itself. He believed that humans could not come at science without their own biases towards an observation, and set out a new framework of distinguishing science from pseudoscience. The success of a thesis could never be considered empirical via one scientist publishing results. It could only be considered empiric if all efforts were made to disprove the thesis put forward. This led to the change of language between scientific thesis, the scientific hypothesis, within the scientific method. Here again is where we see anti-science narratives attempt to hijack and manipulate language. You will often hear conspiracy enthusiasts proclaim that science is not about proving anything, but about disproving it. This is correct, only under the linguistic framework of peer review. The relationship between verifiability and falsibility is not necessarily a contradictory one. Popper analysed the work of Freud and declared that methods like Freud, which served to confirm one's preconceived beliefs, could be found anywhere, and were in fact pseudoscience. The conclusion for Popper was that preconceived notions can prove just about anything, when your conclusion or bias is your starting point. It's only in the attempt to disprove something via peer review that it can be deemed a success or failure. Following on from Sir Popper, historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn took things a few steps further. Kuhn brings to the fore the idea of scientific paradigms. This is the idea that when a paradigm reaches crisis, the fault lies with the researcher, and a new paradigm is needed in order to drive science forward. The Newtonian-Einstein theories of gravity is the best example of this. Einstein does not, as conspiracy theorists try to assert, throw away the existing framework of gravity put forward by Newton. Instead, he uses the linguistic framework set forward by Newton and builds upon it to create a brand new paradigm, one which rejects work that doesn't add up to current observations and replaces it filling in the gaps that existed. For Kuhn, the necessity of solving the puzzle meant that human subjectivity and social circumstance could influence their results. Though Kuhn and Popper had their disagreements over what criteria was acceptable to be considered worthy of the demarcation problem, their work transformed what we know to be the scientific method and what is considered real science. The theory must be testable, refutable, falsifiable, in order to be considered a valid scientific theory. As a science believer, you must be willing to give up your beliefs if your hypothesis is disproven, as that is the only way we can come closer to really understanding the truth about the world we live in. It is this point that our friends in the conspiracy world fall down on. When they are repeatedly shown to be mistaken, they double down on bad ideas. The measured weight of evidence via peer review adds to what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, something that will be looked at in a future video. So why does it matter? Humans are naturally curious and have a constant need to understand the world in which we live. The importance of truth in that understanding means the difference between investing in new initiatives that will drive society forward or hold society back. For this, we as a society must hold every possible explanation up to scrutiny and cast away those that don't add up or that seek to exploit. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has subscribed to this channel and supported my videos. Have a fantastic holiday season and please stay safe in the new year.